Let's set the stage. It's 1921. The U.S. automobile industry is in its prime. General Motors is at the top of the industry's food chain, along with Ford and Chrysler. There's one problem though. The cars aren't perfect. GM and the other companies are having issues with their engines rattling, making obnoxious knocking sounds. Lead engineer Charles Kettering and his employees must find a solution before someone else gets there first. Then, on a fateful day in 1921, Charles Kettering is approached by one of his employees, Thomas Midgley Jr., who believes he has finally come up with a solution that will take care of all of GM's issues: tetraethyl leaded gasoline.
Later shortened to TEL or just simply ethyl, tetraethyl gas holds the anti-knocking properties that the whole industry desperately needs. GM patents the solution and sells the first gallon in February of 1923. A celebration is held. This so-called gift of God is about to make GM more successful than they've ever been. Yet, the esteemed inventor himself, Thomas Midgley, is nowhere to be found on the day of the celebration. Instead, he's lying in the hospital bed, sicker than he's ever been before.
Midgley landed himself in the hospital, in severe pain from a mysterious illness that seemed to be linked to his invention. Despite this, Midgley stood by what he produced, and so did General Motors. Then, a year later, workers at a Standard Oil plant in New Jersey started falling ill. Some lost their memory. Others started hallucinating so badly that they ended up in mental hospitals. All in all, 35 different workers ended up in the hospital in serious condition. 5 people initially died, though 12 others soon followed. Only 49 people in total worked at the plant.
Why were so many people getting sick after working with TEL? How does what Midgley and GM did in the past connect to our present and future?
The answer starts off pretty simple, but the consequences are not. Up until the 1920s, lead had found a lot of uses in different U.S. industries. Paint, stained glass windows, bullets. It wasn't just an American product either. The Egyptians used lead to glaze their pottery. The Romans used it for lead pipes. Even the origins of the word plumber comes from the Latin word plumbum, meaning lead. Yet, these ancient civilizations came to understand one big fact about lead: it's poisonous, even in small amounts.
By introducing lead into gasoline, Midgley was poisoning thousands upon thousands of people. You might be thinking that GM had no idea what they were doing. Sadly, this is not true at all. The fact is, leaded gasoline was a known neurotoxin before its mass production. The mysterious illness that put Midgley Jr. in the hospital was not so mysterious after all. Since the 19th century, lead had been documented by researchers as a leading cause of death in industrial work.
Alice Hamilton, the first female doctor to become a part of Harvard's faculty, became the leading authority on lead poisoning in 1916. She heavily protested against the use of lead and was a part of a public health conference held in 1925 to discuss whether the use of lead in gasoline was cause for public concern. Health experts insisted that alternative fuels existed, ones without lead. They were right. Ethanol had been discovered as a viable fuel option by Midgley right around the time he developed TEL. But GM could not patent ethanol and refused to acknowledge it as a solution to prevent lead poisoning from happening.
Right. So if your health system or your entire economy is being driven by the free market, then why would you even invest in prevention? There's no money to be made. If nobody can figure out how to privatize the benefits, why would you do it in a free market?
In the end, Midgley denied that ethanol would work, and GM carried on with its production of leaded gasoline, insisting that any damage caused by using lead would be minimal. By the time scientists like Alice Hamilton were properly acknowledged, it would be too late.
Lead affects the entire body and attacks multiple organs, especially the brain. Since the brains of children are still in the developmental stages, children are more at risk for health problems. When people are exposed to lead over time, they put themselves at risk for slowed body growth, weight loss, mood disorders, loss of pregnancies or low fertility rates, and hallucinations as bad as those of the workers from the Standard Oil plant.
One of the most impactful side effects of lead exposure is a decrease in IQ levels. A study that followed more than 500 children who grew up during the leaded gasoline era revealed that their exposure to lead is linked to a loss of intelligence in their adult years. By the time they were 38 years old, those who were exposed to the neurotoxin had on average an IQ that was 4 points lower than those who were not exposed to lead.
One final impact that lead continues to have on Americans relates to the country's crime rates. Multiple studies have shown that infants exposed to lead over a long period of time are more likely to commit some sort of violent crime later in life. Populations experienced a jump in crime rates almost 20 years after lead was introduced into gasoline. Then, 20 years after the US began phasing out lead from gasoline, crime rates dropped. The US began phasing out lead from gasoline in the 1970s. It was not fully banned from the US fuel industry until 1996, over 70 years after tetraethyl gasoline was introduced into the market.
That's the story of leaded gasoline, but lead's nefarious legacy doesn't end there. Every year, researchers find hotspots where lead poisoning is just another day in the neighborhood. Take Flint, Michigan, for example.
It all started in 2013 when the city of Flint found itself struggling for money. Governor Rick Snyder placed an unelected official as an emergency manager to handle the city's finances. City officials started looking for ways to save the city money. They turned their eyes to the city's water. Flint had been getting its water from Detroit through the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, costing the city millions of dollars every year. Emergency manager Edward Kurtz made the decision to use water from the nearby Flint River.
Many health officials and government employees warned the city council against using water from the river. For one, the facility in charge of the water's treatment was ill-equipped. Supplies needed to treat the water for toxic chemicals, like chlorine residue monitoring equipment and corrosion control equipment, were not installed at the plant by the time the city's water source was switched over. Plus, the river had been used as a dumping ground for an industrial runoff. Furthermore, the pipes connecting the Flint River to the city itself were made out of lead.
Despite the river's very well-known and polluted history, Flint's water supply was officially switched over to the Flint River on April 24, 2014.
In the next few months, residents would start to notice that their water quality was diminishing. Water that looked murky and reddish-brown in color started flowing through sinks. When residents bathed their kids, they noticed the water had an odor. When they drank a cold glass of water from the tap, they noticed it tasted off. Residents began to wonder if something was wrong with the water.
By August, health officials began detecting bacteria in the water. 2 months later, the local General Motors plant stopped using water from the Flint River as they noticed an increase in engine part corrosion. The story only went downhill from there. Carcinogens from chlorine interacting with organic matter were detected in the river. Then, the water of a local homeowner tested positive for lead. In the coming months, hundreds of homes would test positive for lead-exposed water. Still, the water was not switched back.
In September of 2014, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha of the Hurley Medical Center conducted a study revealing that the children of Flint, Michigan had elevated levels of lead in their blood. The increase was directly correlated to the switch to the Flint River.
Thousands of Flint residents were affected by the water. Hundreds of children under the age of 5 were diagnosed with lead poisoning. About a dozen people died from Legionnaire's disease. Others were diagnosed with health problems heavily suspected of being related to the Flint River. It was not until October 16, 2015, that the water was switched back to its original source in Detroit. 41% of Flint's impoverished population spent 18 long months putting their kids' lives at risk, unable to pay for bottled water and the right filters that would cleanse out the lead.
And there are cities out there worse off than Flint, Michigan. Much like the children of the leaded gasoline era, children impacted by the Flint water crisis and other public health disasters may not ever realize just how much has been taken away from them in terms of their health in the future.
The biggest idea that links the Flint water crisis to the leaded gasoline era is the fact that the fallout from both could have been prevented. If scientists had been taken seriously by the US government, if corporations had taken a minute to value public health over their own profit, and if government officials had done their jobs in protecting their citizens from harm, lead would not have been able to trap Americans in its grasp. As a society, we have a responsibility to fight unfounded theories with cold, hard facts based on scientific evidence. Humans must work together to ensure that these facts are not disregarded or put down by others who would rather ignore the truth. We owe this much to future generations of humankind that will inherit this earth long after we are gone.